Tonight, we're honored to have Russ Ramsey with us. Russ is an author, a lecturer, and pastor at Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee, where he served since 2016. Prior to his position at his current church, he served as the senior pastor at Oak Hills Presbyterian Church in Kansas City, Kansas, and Midtown Fellowship Church in Nashville. He grew up in the cornfields of Indiana. He received his bachelor's degree from Taylor University in psychology and Bible, and then went on to complete his MDiv and ThM at Covenant Theological Seminary. Alongside preaching on Sundays down in Nashville, Russ is a prolific author and writer and active speaker, and he has several books, including Struck, One Christian's Reflections on Encountering Death, and also Rembrandt is in the Wind, Learning How to Love Art Through the Eyes of Faith, and his newest book, Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart. We are honored to have with us tonight Russ Ramsey. Would you please put your hands together and welcome him to the stage?
Thank you all very, very much for that welcome. Thank you for that introduction. It's great to be with you. It's a little strange also because I've never been to Lexington before, and the invitation to be here for me comes by way of people just having found my work on art, and I haven't had a lot of invitations to come to places where the connections aren't like natural through a lot of friendships and that sort. So I'm kind of blown away right now. Thank you very much for coming. Let me tell you what I'm going to do tonight, and that is I'm going to tell you a story. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you a story. We may have some time at the end for some Q&A, but this story that I want to tell you is a true story, and it will fold in Scripture, art history, biographical sketch of Vincent van Gogh, pop culture, let's see, the preferred logistics of the flow of a museum. That'll be part of it. And then, but really that's what I want to do, is I want to tell you a story because this is one that's kind of rather personal to me. I had an art teacher in high school who told us as art students, she said, if you want to have a lifelong appreciation and relationship with the arts that is rich and full and deep over the course of your life, what you need to do is you need to find an artist or two that you connect with. And then pay attention to them for the rest of your life. That's the advice. She went on to say what that artist will do is he or she will introduce you around. They'll introduce you to their colleagues, the people they share a room with at the galleries, the people whose names are mentioned in the little tombstones on the wall next to the painting that give descriptions of where the painting is from and maybe what inspirations are coming from it. And then he may direct you. Vincent, so for me it was Vincent. And then he may direct you to some of his other friends, the turbulent relationship he had with Paul Gauguin, the Impressionists, people who came after, Rembrandt, who he adored. And then you find yourself down the hall looking at Rembrandt, and Rembrandt introduces you around to his colleagues, to his friends. I'm 51 years old. I've been doing this now taking that advice for the 36 years I've had it. And I can tell you it's great advice. I'm not somebody who went to art school. I don't do visual art. I'm an author and a poet and a homiletician and a pastor. I'm a pastor really at heart. But Vincent has been with me long enough that it's very rare for me to call him Van Gogh. He is Vincent to me. And the story that I want to tell you, because he's Vincent to me, is kind of personal. And so let's just get into it, shall we? This is called Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart, the sacred work of stewarding another's pain. Oh, if I could have worked without this accursed disease, what things I might have done. Vincent van Gogh. In the late 1990s, a special Van Gogh art exhibit came through the city where I was living at the time, and I remember that it was a collection of a few Van Gogh paintings and then a great many works by later painters who were inspired by him, painters that he inspired, and they were all arranged on these temporary walls in this wing of the museum that guided us through this kind of narrative. And so we entered by the coat check, and then we spent the next hour learning about Van Gogh's brilliance and influence. And then we exited through the gift shop. I told you, right, that we would talk about the flow of an art museum. Coat check, gallery, gift shop. We exited through the gift shop, which, along with a few posters and postcards commemorating some of the select works of art in that particular exhibit, the gift shop was largely comprised of tchotchkes making light of Vincent's episode with his severed ear. You could buy an enamel lapel pin, you could buy an eraser in the shape of an ear, you could buy this thermal coffee mug bearing Vincent's portrait with a note beside it that explained, when you pour a hot beverage, Vincent's ear magically vanishes before your eyes. Easy Van come, easy Van go. It broke my heart to see it, and it still does, and I'm still mad about it. For most of us, our greatest shame and our deepest hurts are closely guarded secrets, known only to a few, if anyone. And we protect those parts of ourselves not because they're shameful, but because they're sacred. What if the story about Vincent cutting off his ear isn't really all that funny? What happened there, undoubtedly one of the lowest points in an already tortured soul's life, helps us to see not just his shame, but the hope that surrounds it. It shows us that in the end, we are not our worst moments. In the end, we are not our biggest failures. And it teaches us the sacred work of stewarding another's pain. And it bids us be gentle, because this is a hard world. When the train pulled into the station in Arles Station at 5 a.m. on October 23rd, 1888, a man in a black suit stepped out onto the platform, and he let his eyes adjust, and he took a suitcase from the porter, and he studied the map on the wall by the ticket window, and turned around 1 block south, then a quick left to the square 1 block over. The address he was looking for was 2 Place Lamartine. It was the northeast corner. The 2-story house was shuttered when he arrived. All was quiet in the square except for a faint din of activity coming from around the corner. And following the sound, the man saw light spilling out into the street from the Café de la Gare, which locals referred to as the Café des Nuits, which is the night cafe. Night cafes in France were these 24-hour establishments where, quote, night prowlers can take refuge when they have no money to pay for a lodging or are too drunk to be taken in. The outer walls of the Café des Nuits were lined with marble-top tables, and in the back there was a simple, well-stocked bar, and in the center of the room, a large green billiard table. A few customers sat slumped over their drinks, waiting for the day, and the proprietor, a tidy man in a white suit named Joseph Michel Genoux, emerged from the back and took one look at his new arrival and said, "And you must be Monsieur Gogh. Welcome." The man looked at him curiously, Janus said, "Your host showed me your picture, the one that you sent. And he said that I might find you in need of refreshment. What can I get you?" Well, the sun wouldn't be up for another couple of hours, and so Gogh settled down at a table. And then at first light, he paid Janus, thanked him, and went around the corner to find the house just as his host had described it, butter yellow with green shutters, which were now open. Gogh knocked, and he waited. A quick patter of footsteps came down the stairs like the sound of a man running. An anxious but excited Vincent van Gogh opened the door. Van Gogh scholar Martin Gayford said, "Gauguin's arrival was, it is safe to say, among the most exhilarating but also the most anxious moments of Vincent's life. No sooner had he signed the lease for the Yellow House, almost 6 months before, than Van Gogh had started to evolve a plan. He didn't want to live in the house alone. He desperately yearned for company. Right from the start, Gauguin had come to mind as the ideal companion. Gauguin's arrival was more than a visit from a friend. The two barely knew each other. His presence, which took a lot of persistence and cajoling on Vincent's part, and which had been delayed several times for a variety of reasons that made Vincent wonder if Gauguin really wanted to come at all, represented a crucial step toward Vincent's dream of an artist colony in the south of France. Neither Vincent nor Gauguin were considered successful artists at this point, but both had, though different through similar circumstances, they both had committed themselves to painting as vocations. They were going to live as painters. And so after working as a missionary and an art dealer, Vincent trained his hand at painting at the age of 27. He was immediately taken by the sensuality and the mystery of what the infinite combinations of color and composition could produce. His letters to his brother and others were filled with so much enthusiasm, and curiosity, reverence, and zeal for the craft of painting that it would be hard to imagine him doing anything else. As for Gauguin, the Yellow House was more of a strategic move for someone with limited options. See, in 1873, at the age of 25, Gauguin married a Danish woman from Copenhagen named Mette Sophie Gad, with whom he had 5 children. And Gauguin struggled professionally. His professional struggles combined with his desire to paint fractured his marriage. And in 1885, Mette urged Gauguin to move to Paris while she and the children would stay in Copenhagen, where her family was. And Gauguin struggled to make his way back into the artistic community, and he lived in poverty that first year, producing only a few works. But then the following year, he moved to an artist colony in Brittany on the Atlantic coast, and he found really unexpected success and admiration there among the younger artists who also gathered there in the summer. And he discovered that coastal life really suited him. It was cheap, ran at a slow pace, and so he took a breath and he resumed his painting, and he also took up some leisure sports like fencing and boxing. And he became quite a proficient boxer. In 1887, Gauguin moved across the Atlantic to Panama and then to the Caribbean island of Martinique, a French colony. And while he was there in Martinique, Gauguin painted close to 20 paintings. And back in France then, he brought them and he showed them at a gallery where they were seen by Vincent and Theo van Gogh. Theo purchased 3 of them to display in his art dealership, Goupil's, which is what it was called, bringing visibility not only to the paintings, but to the painter as well. And so Gauguin's relationship with Goebbels was an instrumental relationship in his decision to join Vincent in Arles. Once Vincent convinced Gauguin that he would be the perfect partner for this brotherhood of painters in the South, he pleaded with Theo to make Gauguin an offer that he couldn't refuse: free room and board in exchange for pictures, as long as he lived in the Yellow House. And this put Gauguin in a place where he knew, if I do this, I can live and eat for free, and my work will be seen and purchased by art dealers and collectors. The only catch was that he had to live with Vincent. Gauguin and Vincent got to know each other through letters, through a correspondence, which for Gauguin was a way for him to develop and refine his philosophy and approach for art, writing about it. And for Vincent was an opportunity to exchange letters with a painter that he truly admired. So Gauguin thought about these letters as a way to kind of refine his philosophical view of art, and Vincent was writing fan mail. And in their relationship, Gauguin was the one trying to figure out how to earn a living as a painter. His use for Vincent never really strayed far from that goal, learning how to live as a working painter. Vincent, however, was trying to figure out how to truly live as a painter. He wasn't primarily interested in how Gauguin's influence might elevate his notoriety or success. He just wanted Gauguin's friendship and his inspiration. And so they had these differing goals for their friendship, and it made for a potentially volatile chemistry long before Gauguin's train ever pulled into that station. And it made Gauguin dodgy in his commitment, and it left Vincent anxious about whether Gauguin really wanted to be there anyway. And so he was anxious about Gauguin arriving. What if Gauguin hates Arles? What if he finds the pastoral countryside uninspiring? What if he feels like he's been deceived in the bait and switch of coming to live in this place, and he comes to resent Vincent as a part of that? Prior to Gauguin's arrival, he and Vincent exchanged portraits of themselves. This was how Giroux was able to recognize Gauguin. Each man created a new self-portrait especially for this occasion. And they seem to have agreed to tie the portraits to literature as a way of revealing to one another a bit more of their personalities and passions. And so Van Gogh scholar Martin Gayford again said the pictures were indices of how Gauguin and Van Gogh imagined themselves. Each had presented his image in character as a figure from literature. One thing they had in common was an intense fantasy life in which their own real lives merged with their reading. Gauguin painted himself as Jean Valjean from Les Mis, presenting himself as a bit of an outcast, a martyr, a hero, the leader of a band of rebels, possibly a nod to the Impressionists. And so to Vincent, he wrote of his portrait these words: "It is the face of an outlaw, ill-clad and powerful like Jean Valjean, with an inner nobility and gentleness. The face is flushed, the eyes accented by the surrounding color of a furnace fire. This is to represent the volcanic flames that animate the soul of the artist. The girlish background with its childlike flowers is there to attest to our artistic purity. As for this Jean Valjean whom society has oppressed, cast out, is he not equally a symbol of the contemporary Impressionist painter? In endowing him with my features, I offer you as well an image of myself, a portrait of all the wretched victims of society." Vincent sent Gauguin a portrait of himself with close-cropped hair and subtly slanted eyes, giving himself the look of a Japanese monk. He got this idea from Pierre Loti's novel, Madame Chrysanthemum, later adopted into the opera Madame Butterfly. about French military officers stationed off the coast of Japan, in which Buddhist monks play only a small role. But to Gauguin, he wrote this: "If we study Japanese art, we see a man who is undoubtedly wise, philosophic, intelligent, who spends his time doing what? He studies a single blade of grass. But the blade of grass leads him to draw every plant, and then the seasons, the wide aspects of the countryside, then animals, then the human figure. Come now, isn't it almost a true religion which these simple Japanese people teach us, who live in nature as though they themselves were flowers?" Perhaps Vincent chose the likeness of a monk to convey a posture of submission to his French veteran guest. Or maybe he was trying to say that he himself was contemplative, that he was austere. Either way, neither man was truly like the image they sent. Gauguin was not the hero of a band of rebels, and Vincent could be quite volatile and manic. When Gauguin knocked on Vincent's door, both men had ideas of what they hoped to get out of their artistic union, and both worried that they might disappoint or that the other might not hold up their end. And so their portraits were attempts to prepare the other for who they hoped to be once they came together. But people are who they are. And though we might try to frame ourselves in a certain light, drawing attention to our better qualities, once we let somebody get close enough, they will see what we left out, what we tried to hide, those unflattering truths that have become so familiar to us that we no longer notice that they're there. Vincent took great care and deliberation in decorating the yellow house. From the art on the walls, to the yellow linens and curtains, to the green paint on the shutters, to the furniture that he had been accumulating over time. He'd been renting part of it as a studio since May and had just leased the remaining bedrooms in September. He said, "I have it all planned. I really do want to make it an artist's house." But not affected. On the contrary, nothing affected, but everything, from the chairs to the pictures, full of character. As Vincent showed Gauguin around, he pointed out the canvases that he had painted for the yellow house. Gauguin's small room featured 6 paintings. 4 landscapes of local gardens, 2 pots of sunflowers. Other works decorated Vincent's bedroom and hallway, but as they moved from room to room, Gauguin was surprised to find that there were paintings actually everywhere. In stacks on the floor, leaning against the wall, Vincent was engaged in one of the most astonishing creative sprints in Western art when Gauguin arrived. During his 15 months in Arles, he produced around 200 canvases. In 15 months, he produced 200 canvases, many of them considered his masterworks, not throwaway little thumbnails. Starry Night over the River Rhone, The Night Cafe, The Cafe Terrace, Vase with 15 Sunflowers, The Sower, A Pair of Shoes, and The Red Vineyard. Most of them were stacked in piles in the yellow house when Gauguin arrived. The scene must have been simultaneously impressive and disconcerting. Evidence of creative instability and a manic compulsion to produce at a pace and volume that nobody had ever seen. Vincent's downstairs studio where he produced these works was a chaotic mess. Gauguin recalled, he said, "I was shocked. His box of colors barely sufficed to contain all those squeezed tubes which were never closed up. All told, Gauguin spent 63 days with Vincent in Arles. 63 days. And they were two of the most productive months of each artist's career, and also two of the most turbulent. Vincent treated Gauguin from the beginning as his superior, and he even came to resent Gauguin's tone of superiority, which came across as highly critical and very magisterial. Vincent felt that Gauguin regarded him as a rival, deliberately trying to goad him into anger. He struggled to control his temper, and he argued back with a stubbornness and a bite all his own. During their time together, Gauguin assumed control of their partnership. He planned their days. He cooked their meals. He managed their money, even down to how much they would pay the prostitutes at the brothels. Vincent quickly came to depend on his guest as though Gauguin was his host. One historian wrote this: Vincent's emotional attachment to Gauguin became so strong that whenever Gauguin threatened to leave, Vincent became agitated, fearful of isolation, even once hurling a glass of absinthe at his friend. Vincent and Gauguin were, on many occasions, heavy drinkers. When Vincent drank, his behavior became even more mercurial than when he was sober. One afternoon, Vincent and Gauguin sat silently in Giroux's cafe. They had been arguing over politics, over art, and had been at it for so long that they just eventually turned their backs on each other and stopped talking. And then without warning, Vincent hurled his glass of absinthe at Gauguin's head. Gauguin dodged the glass, grabbed Vincent by the collar, and dragged him out onto the street. And Vincent was about to meet Gauguin the boxer. Because Gauguin the boxer was ready. But he looked at Vincent, and he was pitiful. And he couldn't bear to strike his glassy-eyed associate, and so he went back into the cafe and sat back down. And Vincent shuffled home, and he passed out in his bed until the next day. And he woke the following morning confused, claiming to have a vague memory of assaulting his friend, and he begged Gauguin for forgiveness. And Gauguin replied that he did not mind at all, and that he was accustomed to much rougher treatment if, however, one of those absinthe glasses should happen to hit him. He was not prepared to answer for the consequences. After that, Gauguin decided that it was probably time for he and Vincent to part ways. And so he wrote a letter to Theo to let him know that he was going to leave. But Vincent pleaded with Gauguin to reconsider. And he begged, and he promised that he would do better. And they seemed to reach some kind of an agreement because Gauguin wrote a second letter to Theo withdrawing his decision to leave. But he wrote another letter to a friend where he said, quote, "I am staying here for now, but I am poised to go at any moment." It rained nonstop the week before Christmas, leaving Vincent and Gauguin cooped up inside to pick at each other. And on December 23rd, just a few days after the absinthe incident, Vincent and Gauguin decided to get out of town, and they went to the art museum in Montpelier. And as they moved through the galleries, they started bickering again. And they argued about the works that they saw and the merits of the different painters on display. And the dispute carried over into dinner. And once Gauguin had finished his meal, he just got up from the table and he left the Yellow House because he needed to clear his head and he needed to let things calm down. But Vincent wasn't sure if this meant Van Gogh was leaving. Had he left for good? And so in a blur of panic, he went into his bedroom and he picked up his straight razor and he followed Vincent out into the dark streets. As Gogh was walking across the square toward the Rhone River, he heard someone running up behind him. And Gogh described the confrontation like this. Here's what he said. I heard behind me a well-known step, short, quick, irregular. I turned about on the instant as Vincent rushed toward me, an open razor in his hand. My look at that moment must have had great power in it, for he stopped and, lowering his head, set off running toward the house. Gogh decided that he was going to spend the night in a hotel rather than return to a roommate who had just threatened his life. Vincent ran up to his room and stared into his mirror, cursing himself. And then he raised his blade and he slashed off a significant portion of his left ear, severing his auricular artery, causing blood to spurt all over the walls and the floor. And then he grabbed one of the linens that he had bought, especially for the yellow house, and he cut it into strips, and he attempted to staunch the bleeding. And after soaking those through, he washed his amputated ear carefully and wrapped it in an envelope made of newspaper. And then he pulled a hat down over his head, and he crossed the same circle where he had his confrontation with Gogh and went to the brothel at number 1 Rue des Bout d'Arles. And that week's Le Forum Républicain carried the story of what happened next. Last Sunday at 11:30 p.m., one Vincent van Gogh, painter of Dutch origin, presented himself at the Maison de Tolerance number 1 and asked for one Rachel and gave her his ear, saying, "Guard this object very carefully." And then he disappeared. Rachel fainted when she opened the grisly package. The local postman, Vincent's friend Joseph Roulin, found Vincent at the brothel, half conscious, delirious, still bleeding badly from his open wound. The brothel was in an uproar, and word began to spread to the neighbors of Vincent's shocking presence. And so Roulin walked Vincent home, and he put him in bed. In the early morning hours of Christmas Eve, Virginia Chabad, who ran the brothel, took the parcel Vincent had given to Rachel and showed it to a police officer, who, upon confirming that it was indeed an ear, summoned his superior. The two officers went to the yellow house to look for Vincent. They found the blood-soaked painter in his bed in a deep sleep, and they called a doctor. Gogh knew nothing about any of this incident until the next morning, when he returned to the yellow house to find a crowd of neighbors and police gathered on the street out front. And one bystander asked him, "What have you done to Vincent?" And another told him Vincent was dead. Gogh went upstairs as calmly as he could, and he found police officers and the doctor next to Vincent, who was soaked in blood, sound asleep. And describing the scene, Gogh later recalled it like this. Listen to these words. In the bed lay Vincent, rolled up in the sheets, curled up in a ball. He seemed lifeless. Gently, very gently, I touched the body, the heat of which showed that he was still alive. For me, it was as if I had suddenly got all my energy back, all my spirit. And then in a low voice, I said to the police commissioner, "Be kind enough, monsieur, to awaken this man with great care. And if he asks for me, Tell him I have left for Paris. The sight of me might prove fatal to him. Back in Paris, while all of this was going on, while Vincent was cutting off his ear, his brother Theo was getting engaged. After finding Vincent alive, Gogh telegrammed Theo. Theo had just finished writing a euphoric letter to his sister, telling her the good news when Gogh's message arrived. And so he left a short note for his fiancée, Joanna. Vincent is gravely ill. I don't know what's wrong, but I shall have to go there as my presence is required. I'm so sorry that you will be upset because of me, when instead I would like to make you happy. Vincent caught the 7:15 express train and arrived in Arles on Christmas morning. And he found Vincent in the hospital. Gogh was still in town. Vincent asked Theo over and over if he could see Gogh, but Gogh stayed away from Vincent for fear of upsetting him further and likely to avoid any desperate pleas from him to stay. That night, Theo and Gogh left Arles together on the train back to Paris, and Vincent never saw Gogh again. When Vincent regained some lucidity, the doctors asked him about the incidents on the 23rd, and he claimed that he didn't remember much. But when pressed as to why he severed his ear and gave it to Rachel, he said his reasons were, quote, quite personal. Certainly in the agony of his own anxious mind, he blamed himself for driving Gogh away. It wasn't just the end of a friendship that he so earnestly prized, but it was also the end of this dream for the yellow house. Gayford said he was responsible for the terrible, solitary life that he led, isolated again now that Gogh had left, and Vincent punished himself. The day after Christmas, while he was still in the hospital, Vincent learned that Theo and Gogh had left and had gone back to Paris, and he experienced a violent breakdown. And he had to be restrained, Vincent did, in a straitjacket and locked in a solitary room. Roulin took over the task of looking after Vincent, sending Theo regular updates. Vincent's condition was fragile. He remained weak and despondent. After one particularly rough evening, Roulin wrote to Theo, he passed a very bad night, and they had to put him in an isolated room. And he has taken no food and completely refuses to talk. That is the exact state of your brother at present. Within a few days, to everyone's surprise, Vincent experienced a rapid kind of recovery. And though his doctor, Dr. Felix Ray, believed Vincent would always retain, quote, the extreme excitability that was the basis of his character, Vincent's mind cleared for a moment. And he asked about Gogh and he asked about Theo, not with the same desperation of the previous days, but with the concern of a man who knew that he had put them through an ordeal. A week later, on January 4th, Vincent's doctors allowed him to make a short visit to the Yellow House. And so he walked into his flat, and he found Gogh's room bare, except for the furniture and paintings that Vincent had supplied for his friend. This time, Vincent did not break down. Instead, he sat down and he wrote a conciliatory letter to his friend, apologizing for his behavior. and wishing him well. On January 7th, a few days after that, Dr. Ray felt that Vincent had stabilized and discharged him from the hospital. And Vincent fared well enough at first, but not long after returning home in early March, he again began acting erratically, and he became the object of his neighbors' ridicule and scorn. Some avoided him as though he was a dangerous madman. Others sought him out to mock him and to throw things at him. And then, as one Van Gogh scholar wrote, 81 venerable citizens of the town addressed a petition to the mayor of Arles with a view to putting an end to the turmoil. They requested that the madman should be removed and taken to an institution specifically designed for such people, for which they as citizens paid taxes. In truth, only 30 people signed the petition, but included was the signature of one Joseph Genoux, the proprietor of the Café de Nut, Vincent's landlord and friend and purveyor of absinthe. The mayor did his duty as a servant of the people and ordered that Vincent should be forcibly removed from the Yellow House and committed to, quote, the section for lunatics in the hospital, end quote, where he was once again put into a rubber cell. The Yellow House was sealed by the local officials until Theo could come and gather his brother's property. Vincent never returned to the Yellow House after that. For all of this, you can buy a coffee mug where when you pour in a hot beverage, Vincent's ear magically vanishes right before your very eyes. Easy Van come, easy Van go. One of the most heartbreaking parts of Vincent's story is how he often struggled to remember his breakdowns and his outbursts. Some part of his brain was in a fog. Maybe it was from his drinking. Maybe it was from lead poisoning from ingesting paint because he would hold his brushes in his mouth. Maybe it was any other number of reasons that researchers have speculated about over the years. He just wasn't always aware of what he was doing. And he didn't remember much about the night that he cut off his ear, though it is certainly one of the most common things we associate with his name today. Many are more aware of his madness than his art. Be gentle. Be gentle. This is a hard world. If the Lord, in his kindness, gives us the blessing of friendship, he is most certainly calling us to the holy work of burden bearing. To be a friend is to bear burdens. Stick around long enough in any relationship and you will come to see more than the initial self-portraits offered. Gauguin presented himself as Jean Valjean, the aspirational vision of a man whose primary challenges came from the unjust world outside of him. Vincent offered himself as a man who had mastered inner peace. Neither portrait was accurate, But are the portraits that we are inclined to lead with ever true? Do they ever tell the full story? To truly love someone is to move beyond the first impressions into the heart of things. It's to take on the sacred work of stewarding another's joys and stewarding another's sorrows. To really know a person is to know them by their sorrows. Consider the ministry of Jesus. Consider the people that he met along the way. If you're somebody who has spent much time in Scripture, when I mention to you their names, you will know who I'm talking about. And who are they? They are all people who are known at least in part by their pain. There is Matthew the tax collector. There is Simon the leper, blind Bartimaeus, doubting Thomas, Judas the betrayer. There's the man with the withered hand. There's the woman caught in adultery. There's the boy with the unclean spirit. There's Talitha, the girl who had only been asleep. There's the widow from Nain. There's the rich young ruler. There's the woman with the issue of blood. There's the paralytic from Capernaum. There's the demoniac who lived among the tombs. There's the thief on the cross. We know them. How? We know them by their failures. To know them by their afflictions, that's how we know them. We know them by their sorrows. To know somebody by their pain is to know them by their need. Even the rich young ruler, whose pain was that he'd outperformed everyone, acquired great wealth in the process, had a long life ahead of him, and still felt a curious emptiness that nothing could seem to fill. What did he and all the others need? They needed peace. They needed rest. They needed hope. They needed forgiveness. They needed freedom from affliction. They needed deliverance. Our sorrows, yours, mine, our failures, our afflictions, are sacred. Not shameful. They're sacred. Why? Because they tell the truth about our need for redeeming grace and mercy found in Christ. And that is something that Christ alone gives. And he does give it freely to anybody who believes in him. That's what he gives. What about us? What can we give to the sorrowful and the afflicted? How do we care for the husband who is estranged from his family, for the woman who can be found at the brothel, for the painter with the severed ear, for Gogh, Rachel, and Vincent? One thing we can do is we can refuse to allow their pain to be the only thing or the main thing we know about them. We can honor the truth that it is only the visibility of their suffering, not its presence. It's only the visibility of their suffering, not its presence, that sets them apart from anybody else. It's just that we can see it. And so we can guard their reputations. We can remember through the example of their tears that we were created to hope in a joy that is unseen, and to seek to remind them, even as they remind us, of this hope. We can seek to know the beauty they're contributing to the world, made even more beautiful by the way it kicks against the darkness in them. And we can join them in this by making beauty of our own. And we can, for the love of everything decent and holy, refrain from buying that insulting mug. Thank you.
Well, folks, we are going to take some questions for Russ. We have a couple mic runners. A couple of our scholars are going to be running mics here in the back. If you could please raise your hand, and if able, if you could stand, that'd be really helpful so that Russ can see where you're at. Thank you so much. Go ahead and get started.
All right.
I think I'm first up.
Oh, yes.
I'm Allison, and I read your book, Rembrandt is in the Wind, thanks to Josie Petrie, and it is an excellent book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and there were several paintings and painters that I had never heard of before, and I want to know, were there any that didn't make the cut for the book that you wanted to put in there that maybe we could hear about this evening?
Okay. For the new book, there is one that stands out, and I will tell you the story with a little bit of trepidation. I wrote a chapter about Thomas Kinkade. And my editor said, I love the chapter, I don't think it should be in the book. And he had a really good reason. So in the Thomas Kinkade chapter, what's challenging, and the reason I wrote about Thomas Kinkade, was that at the time of his death, he died of a Valium and drug overdose, or Valium and alcohol overdose, estranged from his wife and children. It's a tragic story. And at the time of his death, 1 in 20 American homes had a Thomas Kinkade product in it. He had amassed a net worth of $3 billion with a B. And I have a friend who's a visual artist, a very talented engraver, and he said, you need to write a chapter about Thomas Kinkade. And I kind of laughed because I do not like Thomas Kinkade's art. And I kind of was like, I don't think, and he goes, no, really, you should at least look into his story. It's one of the most tragic stories that I've ever read, because he is a person who, when he was in his 20s, was this wide-eyed, extremely talented, very, very zealous artist who wanted to teach people the joy of drawing, and he wanted to capture America. And he made this. Back in 1980, when he was in his 20s, he had a friend named James Gurney, and James Gurney was the guy who created Dinotopia. So these two artists hopped trains from California to New York City in 1980. It's 20-year-olds, like doing the hobo thing. And they sketched America from the boxcar of the trains as it went through, and they compiled it into this coffee table book on how to draw. And it is a magnificent book. It is a fascinating thing. And then he started, as he was painting, he started painting these really idyllic scenes, and people started to really respond to him, and it was largely Christians who were responding to these paintings. And what he said about them is he said, I'm painting a world without a fall. And it was people who bear the name of Jesus who were saying, that's what I want in my living room. And it's this wrinkle in an understanding of the need for Christ in this artist who's amassing this empire of wealth, painting a world that doesn't need a Christ. And what I wanted to do in that chapter, you may be getting more than you bargained for with that question, but what I wanted to do in that chapter is I wanted to defend the sanctity and the dignity of Thomas Kinkade, because his end was awful and tragic. There was no way for me to do that without being very critical of the body of work that he focused most of his life on, because he was painting a world that he himself could not inhabit, and lived with the knowledge of that, and died in a very duplicitous way, estranged from all of the good things in his life. And it was a tragic chapter about the way that it's about a lot of things. And my editor at Zondervan, Kyle Rohane, very wisely said, I don't think that you should include this chapter in the book, and let me tell you why. He said, you have written 20 chapters about artists and art, and in all of those chapters, except for this one, You have held forth the artist as a person to feel empathy and compassion toward, and their work as something to engage with for your betterment. He said in the Kincaid chapter, you do hold him forth as somebody to empathize with and have compassion for, but you do not hold forth as art. And so it's an outlier in that. And he said, my concern is that you will have readers in two places that you don't want. You'll have people who don't like Thomas Kincaid who will treat the chapter as a victory lap. And then you'll have people who have Thomas Kincaid things in their homes and like Thomas Kincaid and will feel scolded by you. And he said, I don't think you want either of that. That's not your intention of what you're trying to do here. And so I had to find another chapter to write, and so I left that one out. But that's an example of one that ended up on the cutting room floor. I have done that chapter as a talk with slides, and it was really a poignant thing to do. It was not there was no sense at all of mocking Thomas Kincaid, but there was very much a sense of unpacking, because really at the heart of that, it ends. Speaking to a room of Christians, it ends with the line, "What have we done?" We have complicity in creating things like that. So that's one. Yes. Are there any other questions?
Hi.
Hi.
So I have two questions for you. One is just like, what's your favorite piece by Van Gogh, just out of curiosity?
Yep.
And then my second question is, I'm a student in the arts program here at UK, and through the past year and a half that I have been attending classes and everything in SAVs, it's become more apparent to me than ever before in my whole life how badly the arts community needs Christ. And so I was kind of curious as a pastor, but also as someone who's dedicated to, art and learning about it. Where I think I have my own theories about where that disconnect kind of started, but how do we reintroduce that? Because we've gotten so far.
Yeah. I love both of those questions. I will scroll back to I think what I would consider to be my favorite is this guy right here. Self-portrait with bandaged ear. I have a copy of this in my office at home and in my office at the church, right above my monitor where I can see it every day. It's an inspiration to the kind of pastor that I want to be. I'm not perfect at this, but I want to be the kind of pastor who is willing to let my own woundedness be seen by others. For him to paint this painting, I keep pointing over there, for him to paint this painting was to capture himself within days of the moment of slashing off his ear and capturing himself. It's a painting. He could have painted his ear whole. He didn't have to present himself this way, but he did. And this is a kind of a form of truth-telling that is beautiful to me, because on the one hand, you're looking at a painting of a man moments away from his lowest moment in life and his deepest point of shame. You're also looking at a painting that probably nobody in this room could afford because of how valuable it is, because of who it was painted by and because of what it's about. And there's something beautiful and gospel-y about that, of kind of, Henry Nouwen in his book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, which is largely about Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son painting, said there is no beauty in our brokenness except the beauty that comes from the compassion that surrounds it. And I love that thought. And so this would be one, although what I would say about Van Gogh is what I love about Van Gogh most is his body of work, is I love the whole. So you've got Starry Night, you've got other things, they all have little, but when I step back and I look at it as a whole, you see the life's work of somebody who is desperately trying to find God. And it's profound, and it's in his letters, and it's in all that. It's just, so that's the Van Gogh question. Yes, the art world needs Christians in it. What the art world needs less of, in my opinion, is less Christians making Christian art. What the art world needs is Christians making honest art. If we set out to make quote-unquote Christian art, there will be certain rules that we'll feel obliged to comply with, like it needs to depict always the hopeful outcome of the story rather than the dark shadows, the mountaintop, not the valley of the shadow of death, And I think Christians as artists have potentially the most compelling things to say, because we can look the brokenness and the darkness of the world in the eye and grieve over it and understand that this is not the end of the story. It's not a hopeless kind of situation. When I say don't make Christian art, make honest art, I'm not criticizing art that is Christian in its themes. I'm criticizing more of an industry than I am actual works of art. The same would apply to music. And so that would be my hope, is for Christians who are making art to say, tell the truth. Tell the truth about your own experience, and the reality of your relationship with Christ will be present in that body of work that you make. And I think also what I would encourage Christian artists to do is to think about their art as a body of work rather than an individual piece that needs to say everything. Think of the work that you're creating as a vocation, not a piece here and a piece there, but is an artist producing a body of work that's saying a lot of things collectively together. And the great thing about that approach is nobody can shut that down, right? There are no gatekeepers for that. There's a kind of a tenacity there as an artist of saying, I'm going to write and paint and sculpt things that will connect with people eventually, even if they resist me at first because they hear that I'm a Christian and they assign all kinds of things to that. If I'm telling the truth, at some point they won't be able to help but connect, because they'll find me talking about their brokenness and their sorrow. I tried to do that in this talk, when talking about Van Gogh and telling this story. I never once tried to make you love him for how great of a guy he was. I'm pretty convinced you all love him more, though, as a result of telling that story as in his raw and honest a way as I know how. Yeah, I love that question.
I had the chance to read an interview that you did with Joel Woodward of the C.S. Lewis Institute.
Yeah.
And in that, you make an observation about praying with a pen in hand. And I just wondered if you would tell us more about that.
Yes. I don't remember exactly what I said in that podcast, but I can imagine myself saying that. I think that whether you're writing, painting, whether I'm writing a sermon, whether you're spending time devotionally with the Lord, the reality for the Christian is that we're told that the Spirit of the Lord lives in us. And that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But one of the things that we can all agree on is he's either present with us or he's not, and that means he is present with us. And so when we pray, when we read Scripture, when we study for sermons, study for whatever it is, having a posture of a listening ear and capturing things that you're thinking about and having a place to jot them down, it trains us to think conversationally. I don't know if I'm getting at what you're asking, but this is where I'm thinking about from this, is that I think a lot of times we want to just kind of, especially when you're in college and you're assigned things to read, it's an assignment, right? I've got to read 40 pages of this book. But what's on those 40 pages, at least for me, I could get to the other side of that 40 pages and be like, I did the assignment, but I wasn't present for what the author was telling me in those 40 pages. And between you and me, that's okay sometimes. Not all the time, but it is okay sometimes. There's some books where you're like, this just doesn't need me to give it my heart and soul. But then there are other things where it does. And prayer and creating and things like that, having a posture of listening and actively kind of recording things, I think is a good discipline. Did I say anything else in that you're waiting, that I'm missing here?
No, I think just the idea that we're more focused.
Yes.
When we're involving more than just our eyes.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. We're more focused when we're involving more than just our eyes. Yeah. We're capturing, it's a dialogue. Yes.
I have a question that I think is kind of maybe a dangerous question.
Oh.
And that is, what's your opinion of current status, the current state of art, like the non-representational art that's out there? That mean, like, just not to sound like a Philistine, but like, what the heck is that? The thing you're looking at, like you have no idea what it is you're looking at.
Yes. So like a lot of modern art okay. It's not my favorite. There's a lot of modern art that, I remember walking into a modern art museum once and thinking to myself, at some point I'm going to walk into a room that's going to be a big tower of clock radios all playing different songs. And that's going to be, and there was. It was like, it was there or something. It was like that. It was, TVs. But anyway, I think what I would say about that is, years ago, I was a person that would just kind of look down my nose at all of that modern art, kind of the color fields, and I have a friend who I was going to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and she said, "Oh, go find Rothko. Go look at the Rothkos there." And so, if you're unfamiliar with Rothko, he paints basically color field. They're rectangular canvases, and there's just different kind of rectangles or squares of different colors. There's usually not more than 3 colors on a canvas. They're probably, they're at least as big as this display right here, often bigger. And I looked him up online, and I was like, "Really? You want me to go look at these rectangles of color?" And she said, "Just when you're in person with one, just stand in front of one for about 20 seconds. Don't say anything, and just look at it, and just let yourself just kind of feel whatever it is that you feel." And she said, "Rothko is my favorite painter." And I respected this person. She's a really talented designer, and so I was like, "All right, I'll go." And so I stood in front of this Rothko, and I promise you that after 20 seconds of just looking at it, I wanted to cry. And I don't know why. And then I started looking at, reading about what Rothko does. And what Rothko was doing was he basically kind of had this theory that combinations of color can be an emotional language, can be an emotional vocabulary. And so you can put colors together in ways that will evoke certain core emotions that people have. Like you might think red is anger and green is peace, and these kinds of things. And so he was trying to really kind of experiment with that. And his hope was that people would stand in front of these basically attempts at kind of cracking the emotional equation with color, and that you would stand in front of a painting and you would feel the feeling that he was trying to get your brain to recognize with the color combinations. So I don't have Rothkos in my home. I respect Rothko now, and I appreciate that. But that lesson for me was just because I may not understand what the artist is doing doesn't mean they're not doing anything. And it may mean that for me, part of the exercise is to try to learn like how to better understand what it is that they're trying to do. Some of it I think is nonsense, right? I don't think that with Jackson Pollock. I think Jackson Pollock is doing something that is very, very intentional, and for some reason, even though it's paint splatter, it works in a way that is really impressive to see in person. So, one, don't write somebody off until you've seen their work in person. So if you've just seen it on a computer screen, you haven't seen it. You've just seen a picture of it online. You haven't seen its true color. You haven't seen its texture. You haven't smelled the room that it's in. You haven't seen other people looking at it. So that's one thing. When I was at the Met, I remember having this experience where I was up in that room where Rembrandt was. And so it was the Dutch Renaissance painters. And everybody in that room, in the Met, was walking around with their hands behind their back, looking at the paintings. Nobody was saying a word. It was reverent. It was a slow-paced thing. And then I went down the stairs into this room, and it's Salvador Dali, Andy Warhol, Pablo Picasso. It's all of those guys, and everybody's talking. And it's the same people who were upstairs silent in the Rembrandt room, and now strangers are talking to each other, and they're shrugging, and they're like, "What's this?" And that's weird. And it's this whole like thing. And I have a friend who's a painter who I just was telling him about this experience. I said it was the weirdest thing. Like, we were on one gallery, everybody behaved a certain way. We went to another gallery, everybody behaved completely differently. It was the same people. And he said, "Do you know what was happening?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You experienced the Industrial Revolution. You experienced," he said, "art in the kind of 1850s, let's just say, to give it a date, and before, was largely declarative. So it is, I, the painter, am going to tell you a story. You, as the viewer, your job is to receive the story. Then it became largely interrogative. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to present you with mystery. I'm going to evade a direct message, and I'm going to throw out questions." And then everybody in the gallery is standing around because they have been asked questions and they're trying to answer. And it was a reminder to me that when you walk into a museum and you walk up to a painting, you think you're in control of that experience. You think, I'm the one who's walking up to this painting. I'm going to feel what I feel. I'm going to have the... No, you're not. You are in the hands of somebody who's got you right where they want you, and they're going to have their way with you, including the sequence in which you look at the particular painting. It's masterful. Rembrandt does this. When you walk up to a Rembrandt painting, you actually look at 6 pictures, not one, because he trains your eye to go here, and then 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 here. And you just, because of the way our brains are wired, and because we look for eye contact, and because we're drawn to light, it's just how it goes. It's how it goes. It's a masterful thing. So, how are we doing?
We'll take just a couple more questions.
Great.
That sounds good with you, Russ.
That was a great question. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I just had a quick question. I was curious, what do you think are some examples of good contemporary Christian art? Because when I think of the great Christian artists, they're all like probably at least 500 years old. So I was just wondering if there's some artists you could give us that we can Google tonight to look at when we get home.
One of the great things about the era that we live in now is that a lot of really great art that we can interact with is local. So when I think of who are the great Christian artists, I think who are the visual artists in my town that I know, and I know their work, and they're Christians. And so I can give you names. I would give you the name of Jimmy Abegg, who's an incredible painter. I would give you the name of Debbie Taylor, who's another incredible painter. Wayne Brzezinka. all these people, but there are people who are artists in the town that I live in, who are people of faith, and they show work there. And so those would be some. I mean, Mako Fujimura is probably the most well-known Christian painter right now. And so he would be somebody that I would encourage you to look up if you haven't seen already. Mako is interesting because his work is very non-objective and abstract, but what's magic about his work is he has a command over kind of color and texture, but the materials that he uses to paint with change over time. And so he creates these large-scale canvases that in about a year and a half is going to look different than it looks now because of the kind of pigment and mineral that he uses in the application of on the canvas. And so it's a really fascinating precious stone, gold, silver. It's a really interesting thing that he does. So Mako would be one. But I really would encourage you, like find local artists and the great thing about getting to know local artists is you can often afford their work too, to put in your home. And it's great to have original art in your home. It's a great thing. Yeah.
Okay, one more question.
All right. Who do we got? I see right here. You got it? We have one back. Okay. Can we do two? All right, because we'll catch you. We got him.
So people often draw a lot of meaning from older art. Do you think that more modern art has less meaning, or do we just have to look at it a different way to draw that meaning from it?
I think it depends on the work, depends on the artist. I do think it's probably a false dichotomy to say older art had more meaning than more recent art. But I do think, though, that there is a lot of more modern. The modern art era is an era where people would create art and say, well, it's up to you to decide what it means. And I have no patience for that. Like, I'm like, well, why are you wasting my time if this isn't a conversation, right? I think there's a lot of, I don't think it's fair to say, which you're not saying, but I don't think it's fair to say that today's art has less meaning on the whole. It may be less direct. Sometimes it may be actually more on the nose now, depending on the artist we're talking about. But I do think, though, we ascribe a lot of meaning and intent to older works that the artist didn't intend, that we put a lot on them to say, oh, look at how he's trying to express. Because if somebody was painting in the 1600s, they weren't hired to express themselves. They were hired to create an altarpiece for a church. And they would express themselves in that. But a lot of art that's created today is expressly committed for the purpose of expressing oneself, right? And back in those days, though, it wasn't. It was largely commission-based, and it was very specific as to what it was that they were going to paint, which is why you go into museums and you see all these portraits of people that you've never heard of. It's because Rembrandt's bread and butter was painting people's portraits so they could hang them in their homes and impress their rich friends. And so, like, you see all these portraits of these people who you have no idea who they are. It's just because they hired Rembrandt like they would hire, Olin Mills to come take pictures of their family, They just had money to do that kind of thing. Yeah, okay, right here, last question.
I was wondering, other than Van Gogh, Rembrandt, Kincaid, what are some other artists with fascinating stories?
Yes, so not to plug my books, but Rembrandt is in the Wind and Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart. This was a chapter from one of those books. Each chapter is a standalone about a different artist. My go-tos of my personal favorites in terms of fascinating stories would be Edward Hopper. Is a fascinating case study in loneliness and self-centeredness. And so I have a chapter about him. Norman Rockwell is a fascinating case in somebody who we think we know who he was, But later in his career, he devoted a lot of his artistic bandwidth to addressing the civil rights era in a really haunting way that involved a kind of an artistic repentance on his part for some of his sentimentality and his tongue-in-cheek nature of the roles of people of color. So he would be one. Let's see, Caravaggio is a painter who, Italian Renaissance, painted these profound pictures of the depth of the meaning of the story of the gospel, and was also just a horrible person. He murdered people. He was always on the run from the law. He was very promiscuous, died from syphilis, alone on a beach. Just a tragic, tragic story. And so he's this picture of like this example of, on the one hand, the sacred, and on the other hand, the profane. And he was this riddle, this paradox. And so Michelangelo, particularly Michelangelo's process of creating David, is a fascinating story. And if you're writing these down, a couple other quick ones. Henry Ossawa Tanner, I won't say much about him, but Henry Ossawa Tanner, and then Lilias Trotter, who was a watercolorist who lived in London during the Victorian era, and she was recognized early on at a young age as having this incredible talent. She was taken under the wing of one of the leading art critics and painters at the time, John Ruskin, who is, if you spend any time in London, it's like he appears everywhere in everything. He said that she had the potential to be the greatest living painter of her era. And she left it to be a missionary to Arab women in Algeria. And she went to do this work without the blessing of a sending agency, because she was sickly. And every sending agency that she tried to go through said, your two problems are you're a woman traveling alone in an Arab country, and you're in poor health. And so she and two other women decided, we're just going to go, and we're going to live among the women and children, the orphans and widows of Algeria, and just care for them and minister to them. And didn't speak any Arabic. Guess how she communicated? She painted. And guess how else she communicated? She learned Arabic. And so she is a person who, what I love about Lilias Trotter is if you are a person, I'm sure there are people in this room who can resonate with this. I spent my younger years as a songwriter and a performing musician. I haven't done that in a long time. When I pick up my guitar or I sit at a piano, I am very, very rusty, and I know that for me to get anywhere back close to where I used to be would require time and patience and practice that I do not have margin for in my life right now. And there's an ache that comes with that. And for anybody who, whether it was a sport or an instrument or painting or whatever, that when you were younger felt like this is a big part of who I am. To know me is to know I do this. And then to have to set that aside because life calls you into other things that require that bandwidth of yours. There's a lonesome ache that comes with it. And the thing I love about Lilias Trotter is she set aside her art to be a missionary. And the ending of the story is not, look at how she served the Lord and sacrificed this thing and was able to go be a missionary. What a great reward for her. The ending of the story is, yes, she did that, and also, as the years would go by and she would pick up her paints to paint, she experienced the sensation of being rusty, and it felt foreign to her. And she lost the ability to do what she had done when she was younger, and she described it to her friends as a deep and holy sorrow. I leave you with that.
Folks, would you give it up one more time?
Thank you.
Well, folks, if we haven't met, my name is Nick Grounds. I work here at the Lewis House. I would love to meet you afterwards. I don't want to volunteer too much of Russ's time, but I presume he might be around for a bit afterwards. So please, feel free to come up and say hello. A few closing announcements. First, I want to thank our sponsors and our patrons again for tonight, the Petries. We're so grateful. This has been such a lovely and unique night to bring in someone to speak about art, something that many of us care about here. So grateful to them. Thank you again to the Petries. Also, if you have interest in being a patron for a lecture or sponsoring something we're doing here at the Lewis House, we have these patron cards in your pamphlets for tonight. Check those out. We have 5 opportunities on here of how you can get involved at the Lewis House, from sponsoring our classes that we teach, which are accredited by Asbury. I'm sure Brian mentioned that earlier, our director. But look at these and see if you have interest. Please, we'd love to hear from you. You can fill one of these cards out and turn it in as you leave. We'd love that, and we'd love to connect with you more about this. Last thing I'll say, our final lecture for this semester is on Wednesday, December 4th, and our very own Dr. Derek King, who is our our very own Dr. Derek King, our theologian, our scholar in residence, has been engaged for quite some time on the relationship between our attention and theology, and how our attention forms us in more ways than we realize. And so our lecture on December 4th will be called Good Looking, Why Attention Matters More Than You Think. If you want to get some spoilers, I'm sure you can go ask him. He's sitting right here in the back. I'm sure he'd love to tell you about it. But folks, that'll be our last lecture for this school year, and we'll look forward to welcoming Abigail Favali in January and the start of the new year. Thank you for coming. Drive safe. See you next time.